First Saturday Meditation Manual with a preface by Father Nicholas Gruner. First Saturday Meditation Manual for use as an aid in keeping Our Lady company on the first Saturdays while meditating on the 15 mysteries of the Holy Rosary as requested by Our Lady of Fatima, or as a guide to meditating while praying one's daily rosary. Contact the Fatima Center for a selection of other booklets with more extensive biblical meditations arranged for the joyful, sorrowful, and glorious mysteries of the Holy Rosary. Textual note: biblical passages are taken from the Douay Rheims translation with occasional modifications and integrations. Imprimatur, Anthony Borwa, Bishop of Gibanga, Liberia, October 9th, 2015. Preface: How to Make the First Saturday Reparatory Devotions by Father Nicholas Gruner. Most important in our first Saturday devotions is the fervor with which we perform them, specifically as acts of reparation for sins against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Our Lady of Fatima summed up the motive of all her apparitions and requests with these poignant words: so numerous are the souls which the justice of God condemns for sins committed against me, that I come to ask for reparation. This is the very heart of the first Saturday devotions, Our Lady's urgent and heart-rending plea that we make reparation on behalf of sinners who will otherwise be lost. Nowhere is this plea more movingly expressed than in Our Lady's formal request for the promulgation of the 5 first Saturdays devotion. It was December 10th, 1925. Lucy was then an 18-year-old postulant in the Dorothean convent. Having returned to her cell that evening after supper, she suddenly saw Our Lady standing close by her, in the presence also of the Christ child, who was standing on a little cloud. At first, Our Lady did not say anything. It was as if she could not speak, being overwhelmed with sorrow. She held her Immaculate Heart in her hand for Lucy to see, pierced all around by terrible thorns, and she placed her other hand on Lucy's shoulder, as if to communicate a most familiar and loving appeal. It seems almost as if, in anguish, she sought to lean for support on Lucy's shoulder. We might each try to picture ourselves kneeling there before Our Lady as she places her hand on our shoulder, reaching out to us with a silent plea. What follows is spoken to each of us. The child Jesus spoke first, imploring, "Have compassion on the heart of your most holy mother, covered with thorns, with which ungrateful men pierce it at every moment, and there is no one to make an act of reparation to remove them." Then Our Lady added, "Look, my daughter, at my heart, surrounded with thorns, with which ungrateful men pierce me at every moment by their blasphemies and ingratitude. Do you, at least, try to console me, and announce in my name that I promise to assist at the moment of death, with all the graces necessary for salvation, all those who, on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months, shall confess, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the 15 mysteries of the Rosary, with the intention of making reparation to me." At that time, there already existed indulgent devotions to Our Lady of the Rosary, consisting of 15 consecutive Saturdays, or 12 consecutive First Saturdays, or even 8 consecutive First Saturdays. Lucy's confessor wanted to know why Our Lady sought a new devotion of 5 First Saturdays. So, in an apparition on February 15th, 1926, our Lord explained to Lucy that while many souls begin those longer devotions, few actually complete them, and many of those who do complete them do so for their own advantage, motivated chiefly by the plenary indulgence attached to those devotions. Our Lord seeks instead that we bring to the 5 first Saturdays' devotion a fervent spirit of love and reparation toward the Immaculate Heart. Is it true, my daughter, that many souls begin, but few preserve to the very end, and those who preserve do it to receive the graces promised? The souls who make the 5 first Saturdays with fervor and to make reparation to the heart of your heavenly Mother please me more than those who make 15 but are lukewarm and indifferent. Several years later, in a revelation of May 29, 1930, our Lord also explained his reason for specifying 5 days of reparation. My daughter, the reason is simple. There are 5 types of offenses and blasphemies committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. 1. Blasphemies against her Immaculate Conception. 2. Blasphemies against her virginity. 3. Blasphemies against her divine maternity, refusing at the same time to recognize her as the mother of men. 4. The blasphemies of those who publicly seek to sow in the hearts of children indifference or scorn, or even hatred of his Immaculate Mother. 5. The offenses of those who outrage her directly in her holy images. See, my daughter, the motive for which the Immaculate Heart of Mary inspired me to ask for this little reparation, and in consideration of it, to move my mercy to pardon souls who have had the misfortune of offending her. As for you, always seek by your prayers and sacrifices to move my mercy to pity for these poor souls. In the same vein, in a 1929 letter to her confessor, Lucy summed up precisely why we must attach such great importance to this devotion. Our good Lord, in his infinite mercy, asked me to make reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and to implore pardon and mercy in favor of souls who blaspheme against her, because the divine mercy does not pardon these souls without reparation. So we see that above all, the first Saturday devotions are to be performed as fervent acts of reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But how exactly are we to do this? The 3 children of Fatima, who were instructed by Our Lady herself, are the best guides. Sister Lucy has left us a number of priceless examples of their manner of making such offerings. Lucy recalls the days following Our Lady's first apparition. Ever since the day Our Lady taught us to offer our sacrifices to Jesus any time we had something to suffer, or agreed to make a sacrifice, Jacinta asked, "Did you already tell Jesus that it's for love of him?" If I said I hadn't, she answered, "Then I'll tell him." And joining her hands, she raised her eyes to heaven and said, "O Jesus, it is for love of thee, and for the conversion of sinners." A simple prayer such as this, even if said silently, will transform any act of sacrifice into a special offering of reparation. We notice in the above example that at the early time in the history of the apparitions, the children were not yet aware of our Lord's desire that such sacrifices be made as acts of reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. When they later understood this, they added the necessary words to their prayer to make their sacrifices into formal acts of reparation to the Immaculate Heart, as we see in this example from the time of their imprisonment. After being separated for a while, we were reunited in one of the other rooms of the prison. When they told us that they were coming soon to take us away to be fried alive, Jacinta went aside and stood by a window overlooking the cattle market. I thought at first that she was trying to distract her thoughts with the view, but I soon realized that she was crying. I went over and drew her close to me, asking her why she was crying. "Because we are going to die," she replied, "without ever seeing our parents again, not even our mothers." With tears running down her cheeks, she added, "I would like at least to see my mother. Don't you want, then, to offer this sacrifice for the conversion of sinners? I do want to, I do. With her face bathed in tears, she joined her hands, raised her eyes to heaven, and made her offering. O my Jesus, this is for love of thee, for the conversion of sinners, for the Holy Father, and in reparation for the sins committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Is it necessary to explicitly formulate our intention of reparation to the Immaculate Heart in performing the first Saturday devotions? Yes, but I'm afraid many Catholics mistakenly think that the general intention of making the first Saturdays suffices. On the contrary, as Our Lady said, each of the 4 requested acts, confession, Holy Communion, praying 5 decades of the Rosary, and meditating for 15 minutes on the 15 mysteries of the Rosary, is to be performed with the intention of making reparation to me. It is also clear from our Lord's own words that the thought of making reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary must be present in each of the acts. In the course of the February 15, 1926 apparition mentioned above, Lucy asked our Lord about making the confession on a day other than the first Saturday, and then she went on to ask specifically about whether it was necessary that this express intention be formed in conjunction with the acts. My Jesus, many souls find it difficult to confess on Saturday. Will you allow a confession within 8 days to be valid? Yes, it can even be made later on, provided that the souls are in the state of grace when they receive me on the first Saturday, and that, when making their confession, they had the intention of making reparation to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. My Jesus, and those who forget to form this intention, they can form it at the next confession, taking advantage of their first opportunity to go to confession. In other words, they needed to go to confession again, not in order to have their sins forgiven, but in order to fulfill the conditions of the 5 first Saturdays promised. Lucy is obviously asking about people who have purposely gone to confession precisely in order to make their first Saturday devotion. At the time of making their confession, however, they forgot to formulate an intention of offering it as an act of reparation to the Immaculate Heart. Will the confession count, she asks, towards the performing of the 5 first Saturdays, in spite of not being specifically offered as an act of reparation? Our Lord answered in the negative. The case is obviously the same for the Rosary, the 15-minute meditation, and the communion of reparation. Clearly, it is not enough to have a mere general purpose in mind of making the 5 first Saturdays. Formulating an intention of reparation with each act is essential to this devotion. Zealous confessors help their first Saturday penitents to remember to form their intentions by asking, do you wish to offer this confession as an act of reparation to the Immaculate Heart? In the same way, if you are making the first Saturday as a family, it is a very good practice for the one leading the rosary or meditation to begin with a reminder to everyone in the group to form their intention, such as by saying, we offer this rosary or meditation in reparation for the blasphemies committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We should not be discouraged if we have difficulty remembering to form our intention, even if this causes us to have to repeat some of the devotions. We should simply accept our Lord's invitation through these circumstances to make another confession sooner than we otherwise would have, or to repeat the other devotions, as the case may be. An important distinction arises in this regard, however. The communion, the rosary, and the meditation, unlike the confession, must be made on the first Saturday itself. Thus, if we realize our oversight before the first Saturday has passed, we can make another meditation or pray another rosary, this time making the necessary intention, without compromising our progress through a set of consecutive first Saturdays. But if the first Saturday has passed when we realize that we forgot to form our intention for the rosary or meditation, we will need to start our 5 first Saturdays again. Likewise, since we receive Holy Communion only once per day, we would have to start the devotion again if we forgot to formulate our intention at the time of the communion. Thus, it is not unusual that a person might require more than 5 Saturdays to complete the devotion, but the acts of reparation which Our Lady asks of us are not burdensome, so having to start over, possibly even more than once, is nothing to fret about. To be completely precise about this point, we should mention that in remote parishes where there is no Mass on Saturday, a priest may allow the faithful to make their first Saturday devotions on the Sunday following the first Saturday. Our Lord told Sister Lucy in the above mentioned revelation of May 29, 1930, the practice of this devotion will be equally acceptable on the Sunday following the first Saturday, when my priests, for a just cause, allow it to souls. But this concession, which requires the permission of a priest, is only for when circumstances prevent us from being able to perform the devotion on the first Saturday, and not because we forgot to form the intention of reparation. Finally, we must not make the mistake of thinking that we are finished with Our Lady's request after we have made the 5 first Saturdays. It was Sister Lucy's practice to make consecutive 5 first Saturdays devotions, one after another, throughout her life. As for myself, she said, I avow that I am never so happy as when the first Saturday arrives. And regarding our own part in embracing this devotion, she added, the greatest joy that I experience is to see the Immaculate Heart of our most tender Mother known, loved, and consoled by the means of this devotion. At the very least, we should always continue to make a fervent communion of reparation each month on the first Saturday, and we must seriously encourage our fellow Catholics to do so too. We simply cannot do enough to promote this beautiful devotion, which is so consoling to our Heavenly Mother, and so necessary for our preservation. Frere Michael, the foremost living expert on the Fatima apparitions, writes, to save souls, all souls, especially those who are most in need, to snatch them all from the fire of hell which threatens them, is then, in the final analysis, the principal intention of the practice of the first Saturdays of the month, just as it was already the same intention Our Lady indicated on August 19, 1917, urgently inviting the 3 shepherds to pray and make sacrifices. Pray, pray much, and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have nobody to pray and make sacrifices for them. The Blessed Virgin Mary has been constituted universal mediatrix and mother of divine grace. Nevertheless, by a design of providence which wills us to be joined to her, she cannot act alone. She needs us, our consoling love, and our little devotions of reparation to save souls from hell. Exalted and terrible, remarkable mystery of the communion of saints, which makes the salvation of many souls really dependent on our own generosity. And what a motive for generosity on our part! For how could we refuse this missionary action which Our Lady awaits of us, which she has made so easy to fulfill? Now, the most perfect sacrifice, the most efficacious prayer, is, of course, the holy sacrifice of the Mass and Holy Communion offered to God in the spirit of reparation. All this helps us understand the pressing insistence of Our Lady, her ardent desire that this devotion of reparation be practiced everywhere as frequently as possible. This devotion is the dearest to her because it is the most perfect and therefore the most efficacious for the salvation of souls. From The Whole Truth About Fatima, Volume 2, pages 271 to 273. Our Lady is pleading for our cooperation in these reparatory devotions. Through the most magnificent promises, she has assured us that our fervent first Saturday devotions can secure not only the conversion of sinners, but our own eternal salvation as well. And no less importantly, by another wonderful promise, Our Lady has linked the gift of peace to these acts of reparation on the first Saturdays. Thus, as Sister Lucy insisted, our very lives may well depend on practicing and promoting this devotion. Whether the world has war or peace depends on the practice of this devotion, along with the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Lucy wrote those words in a letter of March 19, 1939, when, by all human estimations, World War II was inevitable. She was saying that even then, at that late hour, God could and would have averted that horrible war if enough of the faithful had embraced the first Saturday reparatory devotions. Our situation today is a precise and obvious parallel.